joining me on a quilting tale today. My name is Shaylin, and today I'm going to show you the second block in my Pacific Northwest quilt that I'm making, the Sailboat block. This block is about 15 inches and it has a quilt block within the sail. I'll also show you the method that I use for making half rectangle triangles because there's a couple of those in here. So let's get started. I'm making two of these blocks. One will go in the upper left corner of the quilt and the other will go in the bottom right. This diagram shows my plan for the general layout of the quilt, which I may adjust along the way. The block I'm making today will be similar to this one. It will have a different quilt block in the sail and two sizes of half rectangle triangles. I have my strips cut for the water, boat, sky, sails, and the pieces of the quilt block inside the sail. Let's start with the quilt block. I'm going to start by making half square triangles. I'm drawing a diagonal line corner to corner on my white pieces, or the wrong side of the fabric. Next, I'm sewing a 1/4 inch away from both sides of the drawn line with the fabric squares right sides together. The nice thing is that I'll be trimming the blocks down to size so the edges don't have to be perfectly aligned. Cut along the drawn lines, then it's time to press. First I set the seams with a dry iron. Press the seam allowance toward the dark fabric by starting with the dark fabric on top and peeling the dark fabric open. First I press with a dry iron and then I spray it with my mister bottle and press again, keeping the iron parallel with the seam so I don't warp the shape. When it's time to trim the half square triangles down to size, I align the diagonal line of my ruler to the diagonal seam of my piece. If you use a see-through ruler, you can get a sense of where you want to cut and what you want visible. Cut along the corner of the ruler, making sure there's at least the unfinished half square triangle size remaining. The fabric should extend past the desired measurement marks under the ruler. Rotate the half square triangle 180 degrees and align the ruler diagonal line on the diagonal seam. This time your desired measurements should already be aligned with the matching ruler markings. Trim along the ruler's corner again. I do this for all 16 half square triangles. Now I'm arranging a 4x4 block design with my half square triangles. I'll swap some pieces for better fabric orientation after the initial setup. Once my pieces are arranged how I like them, I'll chain piece the first and second columns together, then the third and fourth. Finger press each row of seams in opposite directions so they'll nest when I sew the rows together. Press the seams with dry heat first, then spray or steam. Sew the first 2 rows together and the last 2. Next, I press the seams open and sew the pieces together. Once the whole block is sewn, I press the last seam open. Now it's time to make the half rectangle triangles for the sails. It will be the same process for both sky sail sets. First, I'll mark a 1/2 inch from the top and side of one corner of the wrong side of the light fabric. Then I'll do the same thing to the opposite bottom corner, marking a 1/2 inch in on both edges. Do the same thing on the other light sky piece from the other set. From this angle, you can see that I marked the upper left and bottom right of both rectangles. Now I do the same thing for my sail prints, making sure to mark the same corners a 1/2 inch in. Then I draw a diagonal line through the dots I marked on the sky fabrics all the way to the edges. Of all the methods I tried for making half rectangle triangles that didn't involve a special ruler, this one worked the best for me. I learned this from Donna Jordan of Jordan Fabrics, by the way. Now I'm putting the set right sides together with the drawn line on top. I align 2 dots by rotating the top piece. Take a pin and stick it through the top dot, then stick it through the bottom. If you make the pin stand straight up and down rather than at a slant, I've found there's less to smooth out later. Adjust the pin to hold in place. Now pin the other corners with the dots the same way. You may need to smooth the top like I'm doing here. I'll do it one more time, this time waiting to pin the first corners until both pins are in. Time to sew a 1/4 inch on each side of the drawn line. Cut along the diagonal line. Later, I should press toward the sail, not the sky, to help align seams later. Now I'm pressing my seam. This is a good time to mention that I tried 2 ways of making my half rectangle triangles the right size, since the tutorial I watched didn't mention the math. I made one set about 1.5 inches larger than I really needed, then tried to cut it down to size, trimming all sides the same amount. That didn't work when I sewed it in with the rest of the pieces. After trying a few times with scraps, I found that adding 1/2 inch to the unfinished size I needed turned out right every time. So if I want an unfinished size of 4.5 by 7 inches, for example, I cut my piece to 5 by 7.5 inches. That way I only need to trim off the dog ears. Using my first block as a guide, I'll sew my quilt block to my larger half rectangle triangle and the smaller half rectangle triangle to the side piece. Then I'll sew on the top portion, and then that unit to the rest of the sail. Because I changed the direction of my seam allowance on the larger half rectangle triangle, it aligns with the seam of the quilt block now. Now here's the important part of attaching the half rectangle triangles on the shorter sides. Use a seam allowance slightly larger than 1/4 inch, between 1/4 inch and 3/8 of an inch. This will ensure your points don't get cut off later. I'll show you what I mean in a moment. Make sure the line you sew crosses the intersection threads of the quilt block to preserve its points too. That's why I sew with the quilt block on top. I use a 1/4 inch seam to sew the long side of my smaller half rectangle triangle. I just finger press toward the right pieces, then sew the top piece to complete this unit, making sure my seam allowance is a little over 1/4 inch. This is why I sewed a little over 1/4 inch on the short sides. When I sew 1/4 inch away from the long edge, I'll keep the point intact because there will be 1/4 inch of sky left on top. You'll see after I sew the larger units together. Once I press the seam, the long diagonal line of the sill will look seamless. Now I'm finishing the sky portion of the block. Double check that you have 1/4 inch of sky above the top point of your sail. If you don't, you can sew a new seam slightly over 1/4 inch until you get 1/4 inch of sky. Then attach the top piece. After I make sure all my points are intact and the pieces are pressed, it's time to make the boat and the ocean. The pieces will connect in rows like so. The boat will need a couple half square triangles with boat and ocean fabric. There will be 3 rows total. When the first row is sewn, it's time to connect it to the sky. I press the seams toward the mast or the vertical boat piece because the seam above was pressed in the opposite direction. Now the seams will interlock. Just finishing the block now. Make sure your points meet with the ocean. finished! 2 unique sailboats with a little homage to quilting. I hope you enjoyed seeing the sailboat block come together. I have several more blocks planned for this quilt, so make sure that you subscribe to follow my progress on this quilt. The next few are going to be sea creatures, so until then, I'll see you next time.